first thing I saw in my new life was a man dragging my wife across the floor by her hair. She wasn't screaming. That was the part that hit me hardest. She was clawing at his wrist with both hands, heels scraping the dirt floor, and she made almost no sound at all, like someone who had learned a long time ago that screaming in this house never brought help. 80 silver, Roan, the man roared at me. He was built like a barrel, leather vest, iron rings on 3 fingers. Boss wants his money, and if you can't pay, the black eels take collateral. The girl works the docks until the debt's clean. That's the rule. My head was splitting. 2 rivers of memory were crashing into each other behind my eyes. In one river, I was Sergeant Dane Cole. 15 years of special forces. 3 continents. I remembered the weight of a rifle the way other men remember their mother's voice. I remembered the mission going wrong, the building coming down, the long white silence after. In the other river, I was Roan of Saltmere, 24 years old. A drunk. A gambler. The kind of man who borrowed 80 silver from a loan ring to throw at dice and grog and let his 2 young wives go hungry while he slept in the tavern's pig shed. 2 lives. 1 body. And 1 fact sitting on top of everything like a rock. The girl being dragged across the floor was named Sarah. She was 20 years old. And by the laws of this village, she was my wife. Last chance drunkard. The collector, Garrick, the memories supplied, twisted his fist tighter in Sarah's hair. She gasped. 20 silver by week's end, or I take her to Greymouth tonight as a down payment. There's a thing they drill into you in selection. When everything is chaos, slow down. Inventory what you have. I had a hangover. I had a body that smelled like a brewery floor. I had hands, I flexed them, soft from laziness but young, with good bones and quick tendons under the softness. And I had 15 years of knowing exactly how to break a man. Let her go, I said. The room went still. Even Sarah stopped struggling and stared at me, because apparently Roan had never once said those words in his life. Garrick laughed from his belly. Or what? You'll breathe on me? Sit down before you fall down, drunk. He turned back toward the door, hauling Sarah up like a sack of flour. So I moved. 3 steps. Left hand clamping his wrist where it held her hair, thumb digging into the gap between the tendons, exactly where the grip dies. Right palm driving up under his elbow at the angle joints we're never built for. Crack. Garrick's arm folded the wrong way. His fingers sprang open. Sarah dropped free, and before the big man could even register the pain, I'd swept his ankle and put him face first into the dirt floor with his arm locked behind his back. The whole thing took 2 seconds, maybe less. Arg, my arm. Dislocated, not broken, I said. My voice came out flat and calm, the voice I used to use on prisoners, and somewhere deep in me, the old Roan was as shocked as everyone else. It goes back in if a healer pulls it straight within the hour. Or it doesn't, and you collect debts left-handed for the rest of your life. Nod if you're listening. He nodded into the floor, blubbering. Good. Take a message to your boss. Roan of Saltmere pays his own debts. 20 silver by week's end, like you said. Now get out of my house. I let him up. He cradled his arm, looked at me like I'd grown a second head, and stumbled out the door into the gray morning. Silence. Then I turned around, and 2 pairs of eyes were staring at me from inside the shack. Sarah, on the floor, chest heaving, dark hair torn loose around a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so thin. And behind her, frozen in the corner with a rusted fish knife held in both hands, a girl of maybe 17, Wren, her little sister. My memory said she'd been standing there the whole time, ready to stab a black eel collector twice her size with a blade barely fit to gut a mackerel. 2 wives. The custom here was as ugly as it was simple. Their father drowned at sea owing money. The village elder ruled that his debt passed to his daughters, and marrying them to Roan, who absorbed the debt into his own, settled the ledger. On paper, I'd done their family a kindness. In practice, Roan had bought 2 servants with borrowed silver and let them starve. Sarah spoke first. Her voice was low and careful, the voice you use on a strange dog. You fought. I did. You've never fought. You hide behind me when fishermen shout at you. That man is gone, I said. I crouched down to her eye level, slow hands visible. Field manual for scared civilians. Be predictable. The drinking, the dice, the hiding. All of it. I know words are cheap, and mine are cheaper than anyone's. So don't believe me. Just watch me. She stared at me for a long moment. Up close, I could see what the memories had been too drunk to notice. The gray shade of hunger under her skin, the cracked knuckles from gutting fish for other families at 2 coppers a basket. Watch you do what? She said. We have 3 coppers, half a jar of fish paste, and you just promised the black eels 20 silver in 6 days. The whole crew doesn't earn that in a season. I stood and pushed open the shack's crooked shutter. Saltmere spread out below us in the dawn, 40 leaning huts on a rocky bay, gutting tables, drying racks mostly empty. Beyond it, the sea. Cold, green-gray, restless. Where everyone in this village saw the same brutal water that took their fathers, I saw terrain. And I had spent 15 years being inserted into hostile terrain with nothing and coming back alive. First, I said, we're going to eat. Then I'm going to show this village something it's never seen. Here's what the village saw that first day. The drunk, sober, walking the tide line for 6 hours, staring at water. What I was actually doing was reading it. The seabirds working one current line and ignoring another. The kelp drift angling around the headland. The way the tide pulled through a bottleneck of rocks at the bay's north hook. A natural funnel where anything swimming with the current got squeezed through a gap 20 meters wide. In the military, we built fish traps on survival rotations in colder water than this. Funnel traps. Weirs. Set lines. Things this village, which fished the way its great-grandfathers fished, rowing out, dropping hand lines, praying, had simply never conceived of. You want to build fences, Ren said flatly, when I sketched it in the dirt that evening with a stick. She'd followed me half the day at a distance, pretending not to. In the sea. Fences. In the sea. Weirs. The tide does the fishing for us. Fish ride the current in over the flats at high water. Tide drops, the stone walls cut their retreat. They funnel into the holding pool. We walk in at low tide and take them with baskets. With baskets, she repeated. She looked at her sister. He's still drunk. He's invented a new kind of drunk. But she handed me the hammer anyway. We worked through the night by moonlight, the 3 of us. I set the lines of the 2 stone half circles, each arm 40 paces, hip high, angled with the ebb, and stacked while Sarah and Wren ferried rocks in a barrow with 1 wooden wheel. My new body was soft, and by the 3rd hour my palms had split and my back howled. Good. Pain was an old friend. Pain meant the machine was being rebuilt. While the mortar of mud and kelp set, I cut and rigged 12 spring snares along the dune line behind the village. Driftwood whip poles, cord nooses on the rabbit runs I'd marked at dusk. Protein doesn't only swim. Sarah worked beside me without a word for hours. Finally, somewhere past midnight, hauling the 100th rock. Why are you doing this? Truly, men don't wake up different. Sometimes they do, I said. Sometimes the old man drowns in the bottle, and what climbs out is whoever was left underneath. And what was underneath? A soldier, I said. It was the truest sentence I could afford. She didn't laugh. She looked at the wall we'd built, and she didn't laugh. Dawn. Low tide. I walked the north hook with a basket on my hip and 2 skeptical sisters behind me, and even I, who had designed the thing, stopped breathing for a second. The holding pool was boiling. Herring. Mackerel. Flat silver breams stacked on each other so thick the water flashed like a coin chest. Trapped by nothing but 2 dumb stone walls and the oldest force on earth. Gods above, Sarah whispered. Wren didn't whisper anything. She screamed, kicked off her sandals, and went in up to her waist, laughing like the 17-year-old she'd never had permission to be, throwing fish into the basket 2 at a time. We hauled out 90 kilograms by my estimate, 3 full barrows, and the pool was still half full. I left it. The trap that keeps feeding you is a trap you don't empty. And in the deep slot at the pool's center, something big rolled. It took me 20 minutes, a hand line, and every trick I knew about tiring a strong fish in shallow water. When I finally dragged it onto the sand, the beach went silent. A swordfish. Longer than Ren was tall, 40 kilos of blue-silver muscle that must have chased the herring in on the night tide and stayed too long. The fishermen mending nets up the beach had stopped pretending not to watch an hour ago. Now they were openly gathered, a dozen weathered men staring at the village drunk standing over a fish most of them had only ever hooked and lost. Trap luck, someone muttered. Tide luck. An old man with one arm and a face like cracked leather. Bran, the memories said, the only one who'd ever thrown old Roan a fish head out of pity, limped a slow circle around my stone weir. He studied the funnel mouth, the angle of the arms, the spillway I'd left so the trap wouldn't silt. That's not luck, he said at last. That's a machine. Saltmere's market square was 4 plank tables and a fee, 2 coppers a table, collected by the elder's son, a soft-handed lump named Pell, who had once thrown a bucket of fish guts on Roan for laughs while the village watched. He saw me coming with 3 barrows of prime catch and a swordfish over my shoulder, and his grin curdled. Stalls 10 coppers. For you. Sign says 2. For fishermen. You're a drunk with a wheelbarrow. Around us, the morning market had gone quiet. I counted the crowd without looking like I was counting. 30-odd villagers. Every one of them had laughed at Roan once. Every one of them was about to be a witness. Then I won't take a stall, I said, loud enough to carry. Free fish bones and heads for every pot in Saltmere right here, right now. Soup for a week, no charge. The meat I'll sell off the barrow at 1 copper under stall price. The square detonated. Hungry villages do arithmetic fast. In half a bell I had sold every fish down to the last bream, 4 silver, 20 coppers in a sack that hadn't held 4 silver in its life, while Pell stood at his empty fee table being very visibly nobody. The swordfish I didn't sell by the cut. I walked it whole to the tavern, where the keeper, a wide woman named Marta, who had banned Roan from her floor for a year, looked at the fish the way some women look at jewelry. Lord's taxmen ride through in 2 days, she said slowly. They pay for a feast table. Fresh swordfish, she met my eyes. 3 silver. 4. And my wives and I eat here tonight. At a table. Like people. A long pause. Done at 4. Who in all hells taught you to bargain, Roan? The same place that taught me to dislocate elbows, I didn't say. That night, for the first time in either of my lives, I sat in a warm tavern with 2 stunned girls and watched them eat hot fish stew and fresh bread until they physically could not continue. Ren ate with both hands like she expected the plates to be repossessed. Sarah ate slowly, properly, and twice, when she thought no one was looking, she stopped, lowered her head, and pressed the back of her hand to her eyes. 8 silver and 40 coppers, day 1. A fifth of the debt in a single tide, in a village where men broke their backs for half a silver a day. I was doing the arithmetic on the walk home, the girls ahead of me carrying the bread Marta had pressed on them, when I noticed the figure standing in the dark outside our shack. Velvet coat gone shiny at the elbows. Heavy rings. Smile like a knife drawn slowly. Elder Oswin. The man who had ruled this village's ledgers for 30 years, who had assigned 2 orphan girls to a drunk to make a debt disappear, who took 2 coppers of every table fee and a cut of every catch. Roan, my boy, he said warmly, eyes flicking from my full coin sack to my new stone weir gleaming at the north hook under the moon. We need to talk about your little wall. The shore, you see, belongs to the village. And the village, well, the village is me. Day 1 had made me 8 silver. Day 2, it seemed, was going to cost. Elder Oswin's mathematics were simple, and they were extortion. The shore belongs to all Saltmere, he explained the next morning, in front of witnesses he'd brought on purpose, Pell smirking at his shoulder, 2 dockhands who owed him rent. So your fine stone trap belongs to all Saltmere. I'll be fair, boy. Keep working it. The village takes 6 fish of every 10. For the common good. 60%. On top of the Lord's 70% tax on everything sold through the official port scale at Greymouth, which was why nobody in this village had ever once been allowed to stop being poor. The crowd that had cheered my fish yesterday looked at their feet today. 30 years of habit. You don't argue with the man who holds your debts, your stall fees, and the marriage rights of your daughters. 6 of 10, I said. And if I refuse, then the wall comes down, stone by stone. It's village shore, after all. He smiled like a grandfather. And perhaps the village remembers that your household still owes it certain fees, back rents, the girl's father's burial levy. I'd have to check my ledger. That ledger was the real weapon. I'd already heard enough in the market to know half of Saltmere lived in numbers Oswin invented and nobody could read. Old Roan would have groveled. Sergeant Cole wanted to put the old man's face through his own ledger. I did neither. In the field, when a warlord controls the only road, you don't fight him on the road. You build a road he doesn't control. 6 of 10 from the weir, I said mildly. Agreed, on what sells fresh at your market, through your tables, on your shore. Oswin blinked, surprised it was that easy. Pell looked almost disappointed. They were too busy gloating to ask what I planned to sell that wasn't fresh, wasn't at the market, and wasn't on his shore. Here's a number this world hadn't discovered yet. Smoked fish keeps for 3 months and sells for triple. Fresh herring brought 5 coppers a kilo on the beach, when 40 other men also had herring. But cold smoked over green alder, racked, sealed in fat, that was traveler food, garrison food, ship food. Greymouth chandlers paid 15 coppers a kilo for it and called it cheap. The smokehouse took us 2 days to build, a stone-lined pit, a sod-roofed shed no bigger than an outhouse, mud and wattle racks, and a trench flue I dug at an angle the others mocked until they saw the cool smoke curl up through the fish instead of cooking them. Why does the smoke travel uphill? Wren demanded, crouched at the trench mouth, refusing to leave until she understood it. Hot air rises. The trench cools it on the way. Cool smoke cures, hot smoke cooks. How do you know things? You can't even mend a net. I've watched you. A child mends nets better. Different war, I said. I'll teach you the trench if you teach me the nets. She narrowed her eyes, suspicious of any sentence with kindness in it. Then she stuck out a small, scarred hand and shook mine once hard, like a merchant sealing a grain contract. From that morning I had a shadow with a sharp tongue. She learned the snare lines in 2 days, reset them better than I did by the 4th, small fingers quicker on the trigger knots. I taught her the funnel angles, the smoke trench, how to read the rabbit runs by bent grass. She taught me Saltmere, which currents drowned men, which families owed Oswin their roofs, which dockhand reported to which master. 15 years of war had taught me to value a good local scout above gold. Mine was 17, weighed less than a wet net, and was worth a platoon. Sierra ran the rest like a quartermaster born. She took over the gutting line, organized 3 village widows to split and salt at 1 copper a basket, paid same day, which no one in Saltmere ever did, and kept the tallies in knotted cord because no one had taught her letters. On the 5th evening, I found her at the shack's table, candle burning, practicing numbers in the dirt of a board with a stick. Alone. Mouthing them. I sat down across from her and drew 10 signs in the dust. 0 through 9. Everything else is just these, standing in lines. We worked an hour. She was frighteningly fast. The mine that had kept 2 people alive on 3 coppers a week had been waiting 20 years for material. At the end, she looked at the board, then at me, with an expression I couldn't read. The whole village says you'll drink it all away by spring, she said. Marta gives it a month. Bran says you're fey, touched by something in the sea. And you? She was quiet a moment. I say the man they're all talking about doesn't teach his wife numbers. She rubbed out the board with her palm, but slowly. Whoever you are now, I've decided I don't need the old one back. It wasn't a love scene. In this place, from this woman, it was a knighthood. Day 6. Det day. Garrick came at noon for his 20 silver, arm in a sling, flanked by 2 new black eel boys for courage. Half the village found reasons to be near the square. Everyone knew the terms. Everyone wanted to see whether the drunk's miracle week would end with Sarah on a cart to Greymouth. 20 silver, Garrick announced, loud, savoring it. Or collateral. Boss's terms. Garrick. Good. You saved me the walk. I set the sack on the fee table and counted it out where every eye could follow. Coin by coin. Slow. 18. 19. 20. Week's interest, paid. Witnessed by the square. His face did something complicated. Behind him, villagers were openly grinning, not at me, at him, and he could feel it. A debt collector's power is theater. I had just rewritten the play. Big tide, he managed. Boss Voss will be so pleased. Of course, there's still the 80 principle, drunkard, plus next week's 10%, and the week after. You'll be paying the eels till you're gray. Tell boss I'll pay it all, I said. Soon, in one stack. Now take your boys off my square, you're blocking the fish. The square laughed. Out loud, at a black eel. Garrick went purple, and I watched him understand dimly that something in Saltmere had shifted under his feet, and that his boss was going to want to know what. Voss came himself 3 days later. You could tell the ring boss of the black eels apart from his muscle because the muscle looked dangerous and Voss didn't. Soft, round-shouldered, dressed like a modest grain clerk, with little wet eyes that did sums on everything they touched. Your boots, your roof, your wife. 2 bodyguards stayed by his cart. A third man, I marked at once, didn't come into the village at all but strolled the tide line, counting my weir, my racks, my new boat sheds. A surveyor. That frightened me more than swords. Roan of Saltmere, boss's voice was mild as porridge. The drunk who pays. I've heard so much I had to come see. What an enterprise. Weirs. Smokehouse. Hired widows. Why, it's almost a business. Say your number, boss. Direct. I respect that. Here's my number. 80 silver of principal. Plus accrued interest. Plus, let's call it an enterprise assessment, since my collateral has so wonderfully improved. He smiled with small gray teeth. 120 silver. 30 days. Settled in full, or by our signed paper the collateral comes due, and our paper, dear Roan, your elder witnessed and sealed himself. Of course he had. And the collateral is everything, Voss said pleasantly. The dwelling. The boats. The clever little wall in the sea. And the 2 assets. Your marriage absorbed. Greymouth dock houses pay well for healthy girls, you know. Nothing personal. It's a ledger. I looked at this man and felt the old cold settle in, the operational cold, where rage goes to become useful. 30 days, I said. You'll have your stack. I do hope so. Truly. It's so refreshing to lend to an optimist. He climbed into his cart, then paused. Oh, and should you think of running, or of anything dramatic, the eels hold paper on 11 families in this village. Any unpleasantness, and 11 roofs come due at once. Neighbors can grow so resentful. He patted the cart rail, and his driver clicked the horses. 120 silver in 30 days. The weir and the smokehouse, running perfectly, cleared maybe 2 silver a day after wages and Oswin's cut, 60 in 30 days, and only if the tide, the weather, and the village all behaved. Honest fish wasn't going to make it. I needed a different ocean. There's a place, I said to Bran that night, in the lee of his hut, where the bay bottom drops past the head, the water goes black-green, and the kelp stands like a forest. Your boats never work it. Why? The old man's face closed like a door. Without slot. 3 men dead in my lifetime. The current breathes there, pulls you down when she inhales. There's riches, oh yes. Big crabs. Oyster beds older than the village. Nobody touches them, boy. The sea keeps that purse shut. Oyster beds. Old, deep, cold-water oyster beds that no human hand had ever thinned. Where there are old oysters, there are sometimes pearls. The current breathes, I repeated. How long between breaths? Bran stared at me. You're mad. It's death, I'm telling you. How long, Bran? He spat, crossed himself with some fisherman's sign, and told me, a slack pause at the turn of every tide when the slot held her breath, a window by his reckoning of half a bell, maybe less. A timed window. A breath-hold dive in cold water with a current you must respect and a clock you must not argue with. They have a name for that where I come from. They call it Tuesday. I spent 2 days preparing the way you prepare an infiltration. Measured the slack window against the sand glass from 3 observation tides. 19 minutes, give or take 2. Built a dive weight from net lead lashed to a quick-release hitch. Greased my body with rendered fish fat against the cold the way channel swimmers did. Rigged a guide rope to a stake driven above the tide line and taught Ren the signal pull. 2 tugs, feeding line, 1 long pull, haul like all hells. This is the stupidest thing any man has ever done, Ren informed me, knuckles white on the rope, at gray dawn on the 3rd day. Sarah stood beside her with the boat hook and a face like carved flint. She hadn't argued. She'd just packed dry blankets, lit a fire on the beach, and told me, quietly, the way she said everything that mattered, come back up. Slack water came. The chop laid down. The slot went still, holding her breath. I went in. The cold hit like a wall, then the fat and the work took it. Down the guide rope, ears popping, 4 meters, 6'8", into the kelp forest, green cathedral light, fish scattering like thrown coins. And there, on the rock shelves at 10 meters, exactly where Bran's dead men had known they'd be. Oysters. Ranks of them. Plate-sized, barnacled, ancient, a treasury growing in the dark for 50 years because fear had stood guard over it better than any lock. I worked the knife fast and clean. 11 minutes, 2 mesh bags, maybe 9 dozen of the biggest shells. My lungs were singing the old song on the last lift, the one that says now, and I gave Ren's rope 1 long pull and let the lead drop free of the hitch. We shucked them on the beach around the fire, the 3 of us, Bran hovering like a superstitious seagull. Most shells gave meat, itself worth good copper at the tavern, sweet and huge. The 31st shell gave something else. It rolled out into Sarah's palm and sat there gathering the firelight, round as a moon, silver-white with a blue shadow in its skin, the size of a thumbnail. Bran made a sound like a man being strangled by his own prayer. By full dark we had 6. 4 silver-white and clean. 1 small and gray, flawed. And 1 from a black-lipped monster of a shell at the bag's bottom, the size of a hazelnut, with a luster like cold starlight on deep water. Sarah looked at the 6 little moons on the blanket, then up at me, and for once even her composure cracked clean through. Roan. What are these worth? In Saltmere? Nothing. Nobody here can buy them. I rolled the big one in the firelight, watching it gather and give back the flame. Watching 30 days of Voss's news turn into something else entirely. In Greymouth, I said, we're about to find out. Greymouth was a half-day's sail south. A real port, 300 buildings of gray stone stacked above a harbor full of masts, gulls, and money. And every coin of that money, I learned within an hour, flowed through one front door. The Gilded Anchor Trade Guild owned the harbor scale, the warehouses, the salt licenses, and the only legal gem brokerage on this coast. Their hall was the largest building in town, marble-fronted, with a golden anchor over doors flanked by private guards. You didn't sell to Greymouth. You sold to the anchor at the anchor's price, or you didn't sell. The factor who received me was named Maston, a tall, languid man with ink-stained cuffs and the bored cruelty of middle management. He examined my 6 pearls for a long theatrical minute through a lens, then sighed as if I'd brought him dead rats. Country pearls. Irregular luster. Provincial water, you understand, the cold models them. He flicked the great black water pearl with a fingernail, casually, the way you flick lint. The guild can offer 5 silver. Each. 30 for the lot, and I'm being romantic because the big one amuses me. 30 silver. For pearls that would retail in a capital jeweler's window for 50 times that. And if I'd rather sell elsewhere. There is no elsewhere. He smiled with real pleasure for the first time. Guild charter. Unlicensed gem trade in Greymouth is smuggling. 10 years on the dredge barges. So 30 silver, fishermen. Today's act of charity. In an insurgency, you learn the most important map isn't the terrain. It's the loyalty map, who hates whom, who's squeezed, who'd flip with one push. The Gilded Anchor sat on this whole coast like a boot, which meant everyone under the boot was a potential ally. I just had to find one with leverage and a spine. I found him at the harbor's far end where the foreign ships moored, the berths with worse positions and double fees, because the anchor taxed anything it didn't own. The Kestrel was a lean two-master flying colors I didn't know, loading salt cod at a pace that said her captain hated this port. Captain Veyron turned out to be a sun-blackened, sharp-eyed man of 50 who received me in a cabin lined with charts and ledgers in 3 languages. Pearls, he repeated. He didn't reach for the lens hanging at his neck. Out of Greymouth. You're either an anchor agent testing my license or the bravest idiot on this coast. The guild hangs men for what's in your pocket. The guild offers 5 a pearl and 10 years dredging. Hard to be more insulting than that, even by accident. That made him snort. You picked up the smallest pearl first, the flawed gray one, which is what an honest appraiser does and what no thief ever does. His eyebrows climbed as he worked up the row, and when he reached the black water pearl, he went very quiet and turned it in the lamplight for the better part of a minute. Where, he said softly, did a fisherman get a southern sea grade pearl in northern water? From 10 meters down a hole, everyone here is too afraid to dive. There's more where it came from, Captain. A bed nobody has touched in 50 years. I can bring up a harvest like this every season, and I'd rather sell it to a man who sails away from the anchor's reach than to the anchor. You could watch the arithmetic happen behind his eyes, the margins, the root, the risk. Then the corner of his mouth moved. The 5 whites, 20 silver each. The black, 50. 150 all told, in mixed coin no harbor master can trace. He set the pearls down. And a standing contract, fisherman. Every season the kestrel calls at your village, not this pirate's nest of a port, and takes your harvest at fair grade. You're building something. I can smell it. I want to be moored next to it when it's built. We shook on 150 silver and on something worth more than the silver, a trade route that did not pass under the golden anchor. Voss had set the repayment for noon at the Saltmere Square, expecting theater. He got it. He arrived with Garrick, 4 bruisers, and a cart for furniture, fully dressed for a seizure. Half of Saltmere stood in a wide, silent ring, summoned by his men on purpose to watch 11 debtor families learn what happened to optimists. Roan. Sad day, sad day. He produced the signed paper, snapping it open like a napkin. 120 silver, due in full this noon. Shall my boys start with the boats, or... I put the first sack on the fee table. Then the second. Then the third. Count it. The square was so quiet I could hear the gulls at the weir. Voss's smile stayed nailed in place while Garrick counted, one-handed, lips moving, and the stacks grew. 20, 40, 70, 100, 120. Silver standing in towers on the table like a wall going up between him and everything he'd planned. 120, Garrick said hoarsely. It's all here, boss. Principal, interest, and your invented fee, witnessed by the square. I took the loan paper from Voss's frozen hand, checked the seal, and tore it in half twice. The black eels hold nothing of mine. Say it back, Voss. Loud. His little wet eyes had gone flat and dead, the sums behind them all collapsing. He was measuring me, and the crowd, which had begun very softly, to make a sound he'd never heard a crowd make at a debt settlement. Laughter again. At him. The eels hold nothing of yours, he said tonelessly. Then, leaning close, Porridge mild, you've made a show, fisherman. Show's end. This one's just opening, I said. Walk safe, Voss. The arson crew came on the 11th night after, which I knew because I'd been expecting them since the 9th. A man like Voss couldn't take the loss. The loss wasn't money, it was theater, and his entire business ran on theater. 11 indebted families had watched his paper get torn. He needed Saltmere to see a fire. So I gave his crew everything an arsonist loves. Smoke racks standing fat and unguarded by the dune line. A moonless tide chart. One lazy-looking watch lantern at the wrong end of the village. And invisible under the dune grass along the only sensible approach. Fishnet trip lines rigged to snare poles, a pit of soft sand where the path narrowed, and 3 of Wren's heavy snare cords re-engineered for 200-pound rabbits. They came at the darkest bell, 4 of them, fish oil jugs and torches, moving like men who'd burned poor villages before and expected nothing. The first one hit the trip cord, and the snare pole took him up by the ankle, screaming into the night sky. The second turned to run and found the sand pit. 3 and 4 bolted into the village's only lane, where Bran, Marta's husband, and 6 fishermen with gaff hooks stepped out of the dark, because this village had decided some weeks ago that it was done being a victim, and had only needed somebody to draw the plan. We bound all 4 to the market posts. On the leader, a scarred eel lieutenant, I found a purse of advance pay and better than gold, a note in a clerk's tidy hand listing the targets, racks, boats, weir, and the White House if easily done, signed with a wax stamp of a small eel. Voss's own counting house seal. The fool had let his clerk stamp an arson order like an invoice. I rode to Greymouth at dawn, not to the guild hall, but to the magistrate's court, a tired stone building where the law lived on the anchor's leash, but lived all the same. Magistrate Holt was a heavy gray man with the eyes of someone who had wanted, 30 years ago, to be exactly this thing, and then learned what the job actually was. He read the stamped arson note twice. He looked at my 4 trust prisoners delivered to his yard like smoked fish. He listened while the snared lieutenant, who had spent a night upside down rethinking loyalty, recited dates, names, and the location of the Black Eel master ledger. Voss has bought clear of this court 4 times, Holt said slowly. Witnesses misremember. Papers catch fire. This time you have his seal, his men, his target list, and his ledger room over the dice hall on Rope Street. 2nd floor, barred shutters, 2 guards who change at the dawn bell lazy on the handoff. I'd spent one quiet evening in Greymouth learning that building the way I used to learn buildings. Take it tonight and you have every debt paper on this coast, every bribe in his payout column, including, I'd wager, the column with this court's old verdicts in it. Holt looked at me for a long, careful moment. Who are you, fisherman? Taxpayer, I said. Saltmere expects a busy season, magistrate. We'd prefer law to be real here when it comes. Holt raided the Rope Street counting house at the dawn handoff with 6 bailiffs and a locksmith. The ledger held everything, debts, bribes, the arson column, and 3 pages of payments to GA that Holt read, went pale over, and locked in his own strongbox without a word. Voss was in irons by noon. The Black Eels, being a ledger with muscle attached, stopped existing the moment the ledger did. His bruisers scattered up the coast within the week. 11 Saltmere families woke up owing nothing to nobody. Martha cried into her own ale. Bran got drunk for the first time in 9 years and sang. And in the books of the Gilded Anchor Guild, I would learn later, a line item quietly changed. The fisherman at Saltmere was reclassified from nuisance to problem. Wren's fever broke the same week, which mattered more to me than the whole Black Eel empire. She'd hidden it for 2 days like the stubborn scout she was. Diving season, smoke season, everyone working, until she'd simply folded over a basket of herring. The chill from the wet work settled in lungs that had spent 17 years underfed. We did what soldiers do, monitored, hydrated, kept her warm, made willow bark tea, and I paid the Greymouth apothecary a full silver for his good fever tincture without blinking, which by Saltmere arithmetic was madness. 3 nights Sarah and I traded watch by her cot the way Cole had once traded watch on ridgelines. On the worst night, somewhere past the dark's deep middle, Wren surfaced from the fever and found me changing the cool cloth on her head. "Don't tell Sarah," she rasped, "but you're better than the old one," and was asleep again before I could answer. When it broke and she was propped up, furious and demanding her snare lines back, I walked out to the dune line and stood a while. Then I went and spent money like a drunk. Wool coats for both of them, real wool dyed from Greymouth, the kind Saltmere girls saw on elders' wives. Boots with whole soles. A standing crate of oranges from Veyron's hold because the scurvy gray under their skin offended me. Sarah fought me on every item like I was setting fire to silver. I won every fight but one and lost that one on purpose. And that evening, walking back from the boat sheds, she fell in step with me on the tide line, where the wet sand erases footprints behind you. She didn't say anything. She just, between one stride and the next, took my hand. We walked the whole shoreline like that. Neither of us mentioned it. Both of us knew the books had been balanced on something, and a new ledger started. The Wave Dancer went up for sale that month. Old Tomlin's boat, the biggest hull in Saltmere, 8 oars and a real sail, idle since his sons left for the army. 40 silver. The whole village held its breath at the madness of it. I paid it and hired 5 men the same afternoon, the 5 poorest, the ones the Eels had owned, at double the day rate Oswin had let anyone pay in living memory. The weir crew, the smoke crew, the boat crew. Payday every 7th day, same-day coin, posted rates. "You know what you're building," Bran said, watching the Wave Dancer come around the hook under sail with her new crew whooping like boys. "A bigger weir," I said. "No." The old man squinted at the boat, the racks, the salt widows laughing on the gutting line with coin in their aprons. "You're building what the anchor sells. You're building a port, boy. And the anchor doesn't share the sea with ports." Storm season was coming. So, said every instinct I owned was something with a golden anchor on it. Storm season arrived 3 weeks later like a siege army. 4 months of grey walls rolling in off the deep, when no hull in Saltmere dared pass the headland and the village traditionally began, politely and quietly, to starve. Not this year. This year there were 800 kilograms of smoked fish racked in sealed sheds, 40 barrels of salted herring, dune rabbit snares that didn't care about weather, and a root cellar I'd made the crews dig in the dry weeks, while they grumbled that I was mad. When the first real gale shut the sea, Saltmere's children were eating twice a day, and the village, for the first time in anyone's memory, discovered that winter could be merely boring instead of lethal. Boring I could work with. Boring was when you built. Because I'd noticed something in Greymouth that had been itching at me for a month. The price of salt. 30 coppers a kilo. For salt. For the white stone that washes up dissolved on every meter of coast in the world that this village was named for, that cost nothing but sun, wind, and labor. The Gilded Anchor held the royal salt license, ran 3 boiling houses that burned timber to crystallize brine, and charged whatever it pleased, and every fishing family on the coast, whose entire livelihood was preserving fish, paid it or rotted, burning wood to make salt. Watching them do it was like watching a man drill for water in a rainstorm. The trick this world hadn't learned: you don't boil the sea, you let the sun do it. Terraced evaporation, the old way of warm countries, which nobody had ever bothered trying on this cold coast because everyone knew it was too gray here, and everyone was wrong. You don't need a hot sun. You need shallow pans, big surface, constant wind, and Saltmere's headland shelf, rinsed by spray and scoured by wind 11 months a year, was a salt pan the size of a parade ground that God had built and nobody had noticed. We cut the terraces in the flat weeks between gales. Clay-lined ponds stepping down the shelf, deep settling pond at the top, then wide finger-depth pans, each feeding the next as the brine thickened. Wind did the first work, the weak winter, sun the rest, and the last pans we finished under roof with slow driftwood heat off the smokehouse flues, a tenth of the fuel the Anchor's boiling houses burned. The first harvest day, Sarah stood at the bottom pan with a wooden rake, pulled it through, and lifted a ridge of white crystal as long as her arm. She didn't say anything for a moment. The wind moved her hair. Behind her, 40 villagers were dead silent, looking at a free pile of the thing they'd paid the Anchor for all their lives. "How much," she finally asked in her quartermaster voice, "can these pans make in a season?" Built out across the full shelf. Tons. She did the arithmetic in her head. She did everything in her head now, faster than I did, and I watched her reach the number and go slightly pale. Then she turned to the crowd and held up the rake like a banner. That was the day the village stopped calling it Roan's Madness and started calling it the Salt Garden. I priced our salt at 12 coppers, less than half the Anchor's 30, and still a margin so fat it embarrassed me. We sold to our own village first, then to the fishing hamlets up the coast, quiet places the guild milked by cart at 35. Word moved up the coastline faster than the carts did. Within a month, 2 things happened in the order any soldier would predict. First, money came. Hamlet sent men in boats through ugly water to buy Saltmere salt. Martha's tavern filled with strangers. My crews doubled, then doubled again. Salt crew, dive crew, smoke crew, boat crew, and wren, 16 pounds heavier and fully recovered, running between them with tallies like a small, furious adjutant. Second, the Gilded Anchor moved. No fire, no blades, guilds open with paperwork. A notice nailed to Greymouth's harbor post and copied to every port on the charter coast. By authority of the Royal Trade License, all guild-registered ports, scales, and warehouses are closed to goods originating from Saltmere: fish, salt, pearls, rope, or breath. Any chandler, captain, or merchant dealing in Saltmere goods forfeits guild standing. A blockade. Bloodless, legal, total. We could make anything we wanted. We just couldn't sell it anywhere a guild scale operated, and the guild scales operated everywhere. The village took it like a punch. 30 families had just started eating. Now the buyers' boats stopped coming, scared off by the notice. I found grown fishermen standing at the salt pans looking like men watching the tide take their nets. They'd lived their whole lives inside the Anchor's map. They'd forgotten or never known that map's end. The guild charter binds guild ports, I said that night, in the tavern, to every head of household in Saltmere crowded between Martha's barrels. I'd paid Holt's clerk 2 silver for a fair copy of the charter and read all 40 pages twice, the way you study an enemy's field manual. Pellbrook across the border water is crown-free. No guild scale. Their fishing fleet buys salt at anchor prices and hates it. The wave dancer can make Pellbrook in a day and a night in winter water, if the crew is willing and if we go as one body. Not Roan selling and you watching. A cooperative. Every family owns a share of every cargo. Every family votes. Every family eats. Silence. Then Bran stood up, one arm and 70 years of salt. My share's my boat watch, he said. I'm in. Martha's hand went up. Then the widows from the gutting line, together. Then the 5 men the eels used to own, first of anyone with real money on the table. Then it wasn't hands anymore, it was the whole room standing, and something in the room had changed temperature in a way I'd felt only a few times in my life, in very good units, right before very hard jobs. 30 households signed the cooperative book that night. Sarah kept the ledger. We ran the first Pellbrook cargo inside the week. 4 tons of salt, a ton of smoked fish, and the wave dancer came back riding high, crew singing, with crown coin, Pellbrook contracts for everything we could make, and an order from their fleet chandler that made Sarah read the number out loud twice. The anchor had drawn a wall around every door on the coast. We'd opened a door in the sea. With the first Pellbrook silver banked in the cooperative chest, I finally did the thing I'd been putting off since the night I woke up in this life. I burned the shack. Ceremonially. The whole village came. That leaning, leaking, one-room monument to old Roan's failures, where a debt collector had once dragged my wife across the floor, went up in 20 minutes of honest flame, and the cheering could be heard from the headland. Behind it, on the rise with a good view of the bay, the new house was already framed. Pellbrook oak bought with pearl money. Stone foundation I laid out myself with a water level and string, to the visible distress of the village carpenter, who had never seen a man check a corner 3 times. 3 bedrooms. A main room with a hearth big enough to stand in. Real glass in 2 windows, actual glass, ferried from Greymouth, wrapped in wool like a holy relic, the first the village had ever seen in a house that wasn't Oswin's. And under the floor, my favorite trick in the whole build, a stone channel running from the back of the kitchen hearth beneath the main room's flagstones before it found the chimney. Fire the evening stove, and the floor itself went warm as a sleeping animal and held it all night. The first cold evening I found Wren lying flat on the flagstones, arms spread like a starfish. The floor, she announced, is the best member of this family. She had her own room. I want to write that plainly because of what it did to her. 17 years old, and she had never in her life had a door of her own. The first night she said it was stupid and she'd rather sleep by the hearth. The second night she moved her blanket in to keep the moths off the bed. The third morning I passed her doorway and saw her asleep with one hand wrapped around the door's wooden latch, holding it the way you hold a thing you're afraid someone will take back. Sarah walked the house the day we finished it the way a quartermaster walks a depot, checking shutters, testing the lot of shelves, counting everything. She ended at the front door and stood there a long time with her hand on the heavy iron bolt I'd fitted. It locks, she said quietly, from the inside. 4 words and the whole history of a debt bride inside them. A girl who had been handed across a ledger like a barrel of fish, who had slept 8 years in a house any man could walk into if he held the right paper. From the inside, I said. Only. She slid the bolt once, just to feel it, and that night, for the first time since I'd met her, my wife slept like the dead 10 hours and woke up indignant about it. We cut a small mark into the doorpost with her good knife, the 3 of us like signing a ledger, a fish, a salt crystal, a snare loop. Sarah's idea. Houses should know who they belong to, she said. I'd built fire bases on 3 continents. It was the first time I'd ever built a home. The trouble with being the only fed village on a hungry coast is that hunger has legs. Storm season inland was worse than ours that year, a failed barley harvest on top of it, and the roads went the way hungry roads go. Wren's market network heard it first, the way she heard everything, a shepherd hamlet 2 valleys over, stripped to the rafters by armed men. Then a grain wagon taken on the inland track the carter's mule killed. Then refugees at Pellbrook telling the same story with the same name in it. The Hollow Men. Deserters, mostly, paid off soldiers from the border war who had decided the kingdom owed them back wages and were collecting from anyone with a roof. 27 of them by the best count, 8 with real soldiering in them, led by a man called Ferris Black, who had carried a sergeant's knot before he'd carried a noose's reward. And every cold mile of road, every empty larder between the border and the sea, pointed them like a compass needle at the one village on the coast, rumored to be sitting on 800 kilos of smoked fish and a mountain of salt. They'll come, I told the cooperative plainly, in Marta's tavern. Not maybe. A force like that runs on its stomach, and we're the only full pantry in 40 miles. We have perhaps 2 weeks. A year ago, that room would have packed its carts and run inland. Now 40 faces just looked at me with a question that had completely changed shape. Not do we flee, but what do we build? What we built was the shore watch. 20 volunteers, I capped it there over loud objections because 20 trained is worth 80 brave. The 5 ill-dep men first in line again. 2 of the salt crew. Marta's enormous nephew. And to my private satisfaction, Bran, who informed me that a one-armed man can hold a torch and call a signal better than any boy. 12 days, the old arithmetic. You can't make soldiers in 12 days, but you don't need soldiers. You need fishermen who will stand in a row and not run for 1 hour on one night. Spear wall, 3 commands, no heroics, brace. Step. Hold. We drilled at dawn before the boats went out and at dusk when they came in the market square where everyone could watch, which was the point. Half of defense is theater, and word of theater travels. Wren's irregulars did the rest. Strangers in the salt queue with army boots under beggars' cloaks, asking which shed held the fish stores, how many men the village had, whether the famous elder slept in the village or the new house on the rise. She sold them salt, smiled like a child, and had their count, their accents, and their lookout post on the inland ridge mapped for me by supper. 8 watching us in shifts, she reported, mouthful of bread drawing the ridge in hearth ash on a board. Lazy after the midnight bell. They think we're sheep with a clever shepherd. Good, I said. Sheep is exactly what I want them expecting. They came on the 13th night, in rain, competent, I'll grant Ferris that much. 2 prongs, the oldest page in the book, a torch crew to fire the boat sheds by the water and pull every man that direction, while the main body of 20 went over the inland wall of the storehouse yard for the food. But deserters and I had studied the same book, and I'd read it more recently. The torch crew found the boat sheds wet down with seawater since dusk, and a reception of 6 shore watch behind a net fence, and achieved nothing but noise. The main body came over the storehouse wall in the dark, fast and quiet, into the yard I'd spent 12 days turning into a box. Pit traps of soft sand at the base of the wall took the first 3. The herring net ceiling, rigged shed to shed and cut loose by Brand's signal, came down on the column like a sky made of rope. And when the tangled, cursing center of the hollow men finally tore free and surged for the storehouse door, they met 14 fishermen in a torchlit row, spears braced on the line I'd chalked, doing the one thing 12 days had taught them. Race. Step. Hold. The wall held. Gods love them, it held, shaking, white-knuckled, Marta's nephew audibly praying. But a spear wall doesn't need courage, it needs neighbors, and no man in that line was willing to be the one who broke in front of his. Ferris Black tried to rally a flanking rush, which told me where he was in the dark. I'd been waiting on exactly that. I came along the storehouse roofline I'd walked 100 times, dropped behind him off the eave, and had him face down with his sword arm in a lock before his bodyguard heard the rein change. The old wordless arithmetic. Cut off the head, and hungry men remember they were hungry before they were brave. It was over by the next bell. 9 prisoners, including Ferris and his lookouts off the ridge, trussed in the same yard they'd come to rob. The rest scattered inland, minus their leader, their plan, and their reputation. Shore watch casualties, 1 sprained ankle, pit trap hours embarrassing, and 1 spear dropped on 1 foot. Holt's bailiffs carted the hollow men south with the reward notices that, it turned out, paid the cooperative 40 silver for Ferris alone, which the watch voted unanimously and over my objection to spend on a feast and a banner for the storehouse wall. The story, naturally, grew with every mile of coast it traveled. By the time it came back to us from Pellbrook, the 20 fishermen were 50, the net ceiling was sorcery, and Ferris Black had been taken by the Salt Elder in single combat on a rooftop in a thunderstorm, which I want noted is only 2/3 wrong. The coast drew its conclusion. Saltmere fed its people, paid same day, and had teeth. I drew a quieter one, watching my 20 stand down that night, clapping each other's shoulders, drunk on having held. These were no longer men who hoped someone would protect them. These were men who had stood a line in the dark and seen the line work. Whatever came next, that could not be untaught. I would need them to remember it sooner than any of us knew. Maston came in person after that, which I respected. Bureaucrats who do their own dirty work are rarer than pearls. He stood at the edge of the salt garden in his fine gray coat, flanked by 2 guild clerks, watching my village rake white gold out of seawater, and his face had the pleasant blankness of a man composing a report that ends in fire. Impressive, he said, genuinely. The guild could use a man who sees angles like this. Factor of a new northern branch, perhaps. Stone house in Greymouth. A license of your own, he let it hang. Or, alternative futures exist. The guild assembly votes next month on petitioning the crown to classify unlicensed salt as contraband. Contraband attracts. Enforcement. Run your vote, I said. Hellbrook's crown-free and the crown likes its tariffs. You'd be petitioning the king to outlaw his own income. I read the charter, Maston. Page 31. You can't touch us with paper, or you'd have done it already, instead of sailing out here to flatter a fisherman. The pleasant blankness flickered, one frame of pure administrative hatred, then reassembled. You read charters, he said softly. How modern. Do you know what the old instruments are, fisherman? From before there were charters? He pulled on his gloves, nodded politely to the salt pans. Lovely works. So exposed, this shelf. Storms this season have been dreadful. I watched his boat beat back south and understood, with the old operational cold, that I had just heard a man stop being a bureaucrat. He tried Oswin first, though. Cheaper than what came after. Our elder had spent these months in eclipse, fee table empty, ledger irrelevant, watching from his fine house while the village reorganized itself around the cooperative and forgot to be afraid of him. A starving spider in a web nobody flew through anymore. Exactly the asset a man like Maston shops for. Wren's Market Network, 6 fishwives, 2 dock boys, and Marta, the best intelligence service Silver could buy, brought me the word within a day, a guild clerk's mule after dark at the elder's back door. Then Pell, drinking on credit nobody sane would extend him, telling a Greymouth girl that his family was about to be restored, that the salt garden was built on village shore after all, and that certain papers would prove the cooperative's lease void, once certain pans had been regrettably storm damaged. Storm damaged. By a storm with boots. It came on the 3rd night of a real gale. Oswin, Pell, and 6 hired Greymouth wharfmen with iron bars, counting on the weather to cover the noise of clay-lined pans being staved in. They found the path down the headland shelf so conveniently lit, one storm lantern glowing in the salt shed window, just as Oswin's purchased information had promised, the watchman drunk and away. The first wharfman's boot found the tripcord at the shelf's neck. 2 snare poles, a falling net of herring mesh weighted with stone sinkers, and a sand pit took 4 men down in 8 seconds of screaming confusion. The remaining 2 ran into Brand's boat crew coming up the lantern-lit path behind them. Gaff hooks, mostly symbolic, since the wharfmen dropped their bars at the first shout. And Oswin and Pell, untouched at the rear as planners prefer, turned to find the entire cooperative standing on the headland in storm cloaks, 40 strong, holding lamps. We'd voted on it 2 nights before after Wren's report, not a trap for thieves. A witnessing. Maston's purse was still inside Oswin's coat, 50 silver, guild minted, with the clerk's payment note folded around it like a gift ribbon, because administrators document everything, even crimes. Sarah read the note aloud to the village by lamplight, slowly, in the rain. Then she read the old ledger we'd taken from the elder's house with Holt's warrant the next morning. 30 years of invented fees, doubled levies, debts of dead men compounded onto daughters. They didn't hang him. I argued against it, to some grumbling. Holt's court took the guild note gratefully, another page for the strongbox he was quietly filling against the anchor, stripped Oswin of office and property in restitution, and banished him and Pell from the charter coast. The last anyone saw of them was a hired cart heading inland in the rain, and I won't pretend the village lined up to wave. The next evening, by show of hands in Marta's tavern, with no other name even raised, Saltmere elected Roan the fisherman village elder. They actually cheered. Stamping, table pounding, Wren whistling through her fingers from on top of a barrel. The drunk they'd thrown fish guts at 11 months ago. I'd commanded before. I just never had it feel like this. Sarah found me later on the dark tide line, our spot now where the sand erases the day behind you. She stood beside me a while, shoulder to shoulder against the wind. Elder Roan, she tried, and laughed at it, the first whole laugh I'd ever heard from her, 20 years late and worth the wait. Then quietly, Maston's lost his pet elder. Voss is in irons. The blockade's broken at Pellbrook. He has nothing left that's legal, Roan. You know what that means. I know what it means. The gale threw spray up the headland, where the salt garden's pans gleamed dull silver in the last light, exposed and indefensible and worth more than every blade on this coast. It means, I said, we should start counting masts on the horizon. We didn't have to count long. 2 weeks later, a Pellbrook crab boat came running into our bay under storm canvas, with half her crew bailing, and her captain, white to the lips, reported what he'd seen anchored in the lee of the Razor Isles, a day's sail north. 3 ships. Black hulls. A shark's jaw banner. Razortide had come back to the coast, and this time somebody had paid them to. Here's what the coast knew about Razortide. 3 ships, 100-odd raiders, and a captain called Bloodbrand who burned what he couldn't carry. Villages didn't fight Razortide. Villages emptied inland and let the wolves have the carcass, and rebuilt on the ashes and called surviving a victory. Here's what I knew about Razortide after 2 days of watching them through the long winter dusk from a crab boat disguised with kelp. They were sloppy. 100 men who had never once been fought don't keep watches. They anchor in a neat row in the Razor Isles lee, burn lamps all night, drum and drink, and send one tender ashore for water at the same beach at the same hour every day. Their flagship, Bloodbrand's, the big war brig with the shark jaw figurehead, moored center like a chieftain sleeping between bodyguards. Strength, 3-to-1 against everything Saltmere could float, 10-to-1 in trained blades. Weakness, every single thing about how they thought. They were raiders. They'd never met defenders. More precisely, they'd never met an entrenched position prepared by someone who'd spent 15 years doing exactly this against enemies who shot back. I had 10 days by my read of their water stores and their habits. Saltmere's War Council, me, Bran, Sarah, Marta, and a 40-man cooperative that had unanimously voted down the word evacuate, got 9.5 of them. We worked the way you fortify a beachhead, priorities in blood-cold order. First, the people. Children, elders, every soul not standing into the fight, moved inland to the shepherd hamlets with the stores, the pearls, and the cooperative ledger. Wren fought me like a wildcat for a place on the cliff cruise until I gave her the signal post on the inland rise. The job I told her truthfully that every battle plan depends on. Syrah never asked to leave. She took quartermaster and field dressing, set up Marta's tavern as the casualty point, and boiled linen with the expression of a woman who had decided grief was a problem for after. Second, the water. The bay was our killing ground, and the bay obeyed the tide, and I had 11 months of the tide's habits in my head. Razortide would come at high water. Raiders always do, beach the bows, swarm out dry. So under the high water line, across the only deep approach lane between the hook and the headland, we planted the forest. 60 oak stakes, ship killers, cut sharp, char hardened, driven into the seabed at low tide and angled out toward the entrance, invisible under 3 meters of gray chop when the tide stood full. And on the surface above them, moored innocent as toys, a scatter of fishing floats holding up net upon net upon net, every worn-out herring net in Saltmere, 100 meters of curtain, hungry for rudders and oar banks. Third, fire. Fish oil, barrels of it, the cheap rancid press we'd been stockpiling for lamp trade. Soon into bladders lashed to the float lines and held ready in clay pots along the shore crew's positions. Oil on water burns low and mean and spreads with the current, and nothing on earth panics a wooden navy like the sea itself catching fire. Fourth, the heights. The headland over the approach lane, the salt garden's shelf, gave us 40 meters of elevation that no raider could answer. We built 4 throwing engines up there. Nothing clever, counterweight beams on pivot posts, the siege physics every army engineer learns in his first year, scaled to throw a 30-kilo rock 200 meters. The crews drilled with the patience of fishermen, which is infinite, until they could drop a stone into a moored rowboat 3 casts out of 5. Fifth, the ground. If anyone reached sand, they'd reach it where I chose. One beach left clean and welcoming, every other landing fouled with stake rows and tide traps. Behind that one clean beach, The village lanes prepared the way Ren and I had prepared the dunes for arsonists, except this time with no restraint at all. On the ninth night, I stood the whole force down, fed them Marta's best stew, and walked the positions alone in the dark, the old pre-mission walk, checking knots that didn't need checking. Sarah found me at the signal post, looking north. "You've done this before," she said. "Not fish traps. This. Many times." "Did your shore always hold?" The honest ledger, no, not always. I'd buried men on beaches I'd prepared. She read it off my face in the dark, the way she read everything, and took my hand, second time ever, and said the quartermaster's blessing, the only one that means anything. "The stores are good, the people are fed, and every line is double-checked. Whatever comes, it doesn't find us kneeling." They came at dawn on the 11th day, on a making tide, exactly as doctrine and laziness demanded. 3 black hulls in line ahead, square sails full of cold wind, shark jaw banner streaming, aimed straight up the deep lane at a sleeping village where, oddly, no boats fled and no smoke rose. From the flagship's deck, it must have looked like a town still in its blankets. Ren's horn sang one long note from the inland rise. The lead ship, the eager one, the young captain's ship, first to the loot, hit the net curtain at 8 knots. The floats vanished. 100 meters of herring net wrapped her rudder and starboard oars like a fist closing. She slewed, lost steerage, and the tide carried her broadside down onto the stake forest. The sound came across the water like the world's largest knuckle cracking. 60 char-hardened oak teeth set against the planking of a hull built for speed over strength. She hung up, heeled, and began, with marvelous slowness, to flood. Ship 2, war horns blowing, sheered off the wounded leader straight toward the clean beach we'd swept and dressed for guests, and into range of 4 counterweight engines she had no reason to suspect existed. The first volley of 30-kilo stones went long. The crews repinned, dropped the beams again. The second volley straddled her. The third stove in her foredeck and carried away half her port oars, and the fourth, from Brand's engine, the old man sighting one arm down the beam like he'd been born on a war wall, cracked her mainmast at the partners. It came down across her deck in a tangle of spar and screaming. And then the oil bladders along the float line met the shore crew's firepots, and the tide ran a low orange flame across the lane between the wrecks, and the morning filled with the smell of burning fish oil and the sound of 100 professional predators discovering, all together, what it feels like when the prey was ready. Bloodbrand was good, I'll give his corpse that much. The flagship backed sail in time, stood off the fire, and did the cold right thing. Ran his remaining strength ashore in boats at the ugly north shingle we'd fouled but couldn't fully close, taking losses on the stakes and coming on anyway. He landed with maybe 35 raiders, formed them tight, and drove straight for the village, because killing the heart of a defense is the only move left when the shore eats your fleet. 35 wolves against my 20 fishermen would have been a massacre in open field. So we didn't give them open field. We gave them Saltmere's lanes, and Saltmere's lanes were a prepared environment. Net curtains dropped from roof lines behind their lead squad, cutting the column in 3. Trip lines fed men onto the gaff crews waiting in doorways. The narrow market lane they funneled into, pushing for the tavern's lights, dead-ended at a barricade of overturned boats, and the windows above filled with the fishwives and salt crews hurling ballast stones into a packed alley that could not retreat because the rear third of their own column was still tangled in nets 2 turns back. It was not glorious. It was a meat grinder built out of a fishing village, and it worked the way grinders work. I met Bloodbrand himself at the barricade, where he'd carved through 2 of my boat crew with a boarding axe and come over the hulls roaring, a huge man, fast for his size, scarred like a cutting board, 20 years of murder in his bones. He had reach, weight, and an axe. I had a gaff pole, a fisherman's knife, and 15 years of the only art that matters in a real fight, making the other man fight your fight. He swung for fences. I gave him angles and emptiness, let the axe bury itself in boat planking twice, cost him a knee with the gaff's butt, then his balance with a sweep on the wet stone, and finished it the way you finish things when 40 villagers are watching and need to see the wolf go down. Knife to the axe hand tendons, pole across the back of the skull, his own banner cord trussing his wrists while he was still seeing stars. The remaining raiders, packed and bleeding in a lane with their captain trussed at one end and stones still coming at the other, made the calculation crews of broken pirates always make. By full morning it was over. 2 ships sunk or burned in the lane, the third fled cruelest in toward open water. 61 prisoners roped on the beach. Saltmere's cost, 9 wounded, 2 badly, and 1 dead young Tam of the boat crew, 19, who'd taken the axe stroke meant for his uncle. The village wept for Tam that evening, all together, and I stood at the burning of his boat with the weight I have carried after every action in 2 worlds, the weight that is the actual price of command. Then I did what commanders owe the dead. I made it count. Bloodbrand, facing Holt's gallows alone, sold his employer for the open sea so fast the clerk couldn't sharpen quills to keep pace. Advance payment of 400 silver. Half on contract, half on proof of Saltmere's destruction. Negotiated in a back room of the Gilded Anchor's Greymouth Hall by a tall factor with ink-stained cuffs, who'd provided harbor charts, the garrison schedule, and a list of which villagers to make examples of my household first. The contract note was in the flagship's strongbox, sealed with the guild's own counting stamp because administrators document everything, even hiring pirates. Holt wrote to Lord Vane's keep himself with the note, the strongbox ledger, Bloodbrand's sworn confession, and strongbox by strongbox, every page he'd been quietly collecting since the Black Eel raid, the bribe columns, the GA payments, 30 years of a coast run like a private farm. Lord Aldrich Vane turned out to be neither the monster of the tax ledgers nor anyone's friend, just a hard-bored aristocrat who had been pocketing the Anchor's license fees for a decade and asking no questions. But aristocrats have one reliable feature. They do not forgive employees who hire fleets. A guild that buys pirates today can buy them against the keep tomorrow. The Crown's writ came down within the month. The Gilded Anchor's coastal charter revoked. Its Greymouth Hall and warehouses forfeit. Maston, taken at the border in a grain cart under the floorboards with the guild seal stamp still on him, documented as ever to the end. And Saltmere, the village that had broken a loan ring, a monopoly, and a pirate fleet inside a single year, received a parchment with a seal the size of a saucer. Lord Vane, it announced, was pleased to appoint one Roan of Saltmere as port warden of the northern shore, keeper of the new crown scale, master of harbor law from the Razor Isles to Pellbrook Water. Saltmere itself was chartered a free town, its tax set at 1 part in 10, its cooperative recognized in law, its men freed of the press gang levy. 10%. I read it to the village from Martha's table, and when I reached the number, the roar took the roof off. They feasted on the first calm tide of spring, the whole coast it felt like. Pellbrook captains and shepherd families, Holt looking 10 years younger, Varen's kestrel in our bay flying a pennant of pearls he'd had sewn as a joke, the salt garden lamps lit gold along the headland, tables down the whole shoreline groaning under smoked fish and crab and Martha's ale, an empty place set at the head table with a gaff hook across it for Tam. I sat where an elder sits, with a silver warden's chain I kept forgetting to wear, and watched my impossible ledger balance itself in the lamplight. Brand teaching boys to sight a throwing engine they'd never need again, God willing. The widows of the gutting line, shareholders now, scandalizing the Pellbrook captains. Wren on a barrel, conducting 3 hamlets' worth of children in a filthy sea shanty, 17 years old and fed and furious and free. And Sarah beside me, not a debt bride, not a servant. The cooperative's keeper of accounts, the sharpest mind on this coast, my wife, who somewhere between a torn loan paper and a pirate dawn had become the thing I'd never once had in 15 years of war. The reason you come back. She caught me watching her and didn't look away. You're doing your arithmetic face. What are you counting now? I counted it. 2 lives. 1 borrowed body. 80 silver of debt, an empire of salt, a coast set free, and a girl on a barrel singing while the lamps burned down to the water. Profits, I said. She laughed, the whole laugh, the one only I got to hear first, and under the table her hand found mine, and far down the dark shore the tide turned and began, faithful as a paid debt, to come back in. In 15 years of war, men asked me sometimes what we were fighting for. I never had a good answer. I had one now, 11 months and 2 lifetimes late, sitting warm at a plank table that smelled of salt and wood smoke. Not the Empire. Never the Empire. The Empire was just the wall I built around this, a lamp, a laugh, a hand in mine. For the first time in any life I'd lived, I was home.